Stanford University.
Okay, well, welcome to CS193P, fall of 2013-2014. Today, we're going to continue our discussion of attributed string from last time and talk about UITextView, which is basically a mutable attributed string viewer. Okay, it's kind of like a UI label, but much more powerful, and we'll talk about that. Then we're going to talk about a very important kind of conceptual thing in iOS 7 or in iOS in general, which is view controller lifecycle. So that's just the life cycle of the controller part of your MVC and how it gets notified at different times in its life cycle about what's going on. Then we're going to talk about the radio station that I referred to in MVC. We're going to talk about it in a little different context than we see in MVC because I just want to introduce it to you now. And then throughout today's things, I'm going to be slides here. I'm going to be stopping every once in a while. We'll do a little demo, and then we will move back to the slides and back and forth as we cover various topics. Okay? So let's start with UITextView. Like UI label in that it displays text, but way more powerful because the text is multi-line. UI label, if you want it to be multi-line, you kind of have to say how many lines it is in advance, whereas UITextView, it's as many lines as it needs. It's also scrollable, editable, or just selectable if you want. And of course, you get all the mutable attributed string setting of various things like colors and all that stuff. So UITextView, super powerful object, but very easy to use. The way you use it is that it has a property called text storage, which is an NS text storage. NS text storage is a subclass of NS mutable attributed string. So you get this text storage, and you can just start setting attributes, or if it's editable, the user will start editing it, and the attributes will just show up on this mutable string. It's a super great programming interface, new in iOS 7. Okay, this is having a mutable attributed string be just vended like this by UITextView and editable on the fly by both the user and by you is all new, and it's really incredibly awesome and easy to use. There are some methods on UITextView like font, property font, where you can just set the font. Understand though that when you set the font, all it's doing is going through every character in the mutable string and setting the font attribute name, font, that thing, to this font. So remember that bold and italic are attributes of the font, okay? And so is the size, actually. So if you call this method set font, it's called the set font setter there, it's going to blast all of your bolds and italics and size, okay? So you be a little careful of that. If you want to set the font, though, of every character and have that stuff preserved, just do a little for loop, go through all the attributes in the mutable string, get the font that's already there. You can grab the symbolic traits that are off of it using the symbolic traits method in UI font descriptor, and then create a new font that is the font you're trying to set, plus those traits, and then set it back as the attribute. So a little for loop there to do that. But I just want you to be careful about methods like set font, which are going to set the font attribute of all the characters. Okay? UITextView has incredibly advanced text layout mechanisms. For example, you can specify the container that the text is going to be in, and you can even have exclusion zones. So if you had an image that was dropped in the middle of your text and you wanted the text to flow around it, even if it's a funny shaped thing, you can, image, you can flow around it, and it's so easy to do it, unbelievable. You just create a Bezier path that encompasses the thing you want to flow around, and you just set that as an exclusion zone in the text container property here of UITextView, and it'll just flow around. So we're not going to talk about that advanced stuff. It's all part of TextKit, which is new for iOS 7. The layout manager is the thing that lays out the glyphs. So it takes all the characters and all the attributes and stuff, and it's laying out the glyphs one by one. For those of you who don't know what glyphs are, they're kind of how you represent a character or a sequence of characters on screen with some things. So the layout manager is the thing that lays the glyphs out inside the text container. So if you're interested in typography, or you're going to do a final project that has a lot of text layout and stuff in it, this is where you get started there. Okay? So let's have a demo where we kind of combine all the things we saw in last lecture and this UITextView. I'm going to call this demo attributor because we're going to be doing attributed strings here. And it's going to look like this. It's going to be a totally new app, totally unrelated to Machismo. So I'm going to say create new project. Let's go ahead and also hide others here. We'll do it in a second. So I'm going to do a single view application. We almost always start with that, a single MVC. This demo I'm eventually going to make into a multi-MVC application at the next lecture. But we're going to start here with this. So I'm going to call it attributor. I'm going to have the class prefix be attributor so that our controller is called attributed view controller. So let's do that. I'm going to put it in developer, same place I have Machismo. This is my home directory developer. I'm not going to use source control. And here we go. So this is just a regular app, just as you're used to. Again, I like to move these delegate things into supporting files because we're not really going to be doing the delegate. This quarter we might actually do the delegates when we start talking about multitasking in iOS 7, but for most of the time you can just kind of move that out of the way. Here's my blank storyboard. Again, I'm going to go down to small size instead of the tall size just so it fits. Okay, there's no reason to do that except for that it fits. By the way, you're welcome to use the larger size in your homework if you want. Because as I ask you to do more and more in the homework, you kind of need more and more space, which is fine. Of course, we need to think a little bit when we design user interfaces that this application might run on some users on smaller phones and on some users on larger phones, right? So we kind of need a user interface that can stretch. And next week we'll be talking about auto layout, which is a mechanism in iOS for you to design a user interface and specify how it stretches and shrinks, okay, which is really important. And not just on different size iPhones, but different devices, iPads, you might be using them in a little window inside an iPad, etc. We want to make our views of our MVCs be shrinkable to at least to some extent. And of course, don't forget device rotation. When you turn your device, it all of a sudden gets wider than it is tall. Okay, well, everything needs to move around to deal with that too. Okay, so we'll talk about all that next week. So let me show you the user interface I want to build here first so that you can kind of understand where I'm headed, and then we'll write the code to do it. It's going to be primarily centered around a UITextView. So here I am looking at all my various things that I can drag out. So I'm going to go down here to UITextView, which is right. Where's that thing? Oh, too far down. UITextView. I can't find it. It's right there. Okay, so UITextView displays multiple lines of text. So I drag it out. By default, it wants to be the whole size of the screen, but I'm actually going to put some other buttons and stuff in here. So I'm going to resize this to be smaller. I also want it to have a little bit of edges here. Now notice that as I do everything in the UI, I'm using these blue lines, and I haven't really told you exactly why that is, but when we start talking about having these flexible sized views that are going to want to resize, these blue lines play a crucial role. And so when you're building your UIs, use the blue lines as much as possible, because then when we start doing auto layout, the blue lines are going to help the auto layout system kind of get a clue as to what they should be doing. All right, so I'm going to have this text view here, and what I want to do is have some text, and I'll just use the default text. If you look over here, when you create a text view, you see you get this kind of pseudo-Latin text here. Then I'll just use that as the default. So that's going to be the text that's going to be in this when I run. And if I run this, I'll just get this text. But what I want to be able to do is select some of the text. So I'm going to make this text selectable. Okay, not editable though, just selectable. And so I can select words in here, and I want to be able to change the color of the words, maybe put a little outline around the characters, okay, do some fun stuff that we can do with attributed string in here. And what am I going to allow us to do? Well, let's see. Let me go get some buttons down here at the bottom. How about let's allow outlining. So I'm going to create a button down here called outline. And of course, let's also let us unoutline. So I'll create another button over here. I'll call it unoutline. That's probably not a word, but no, we know what we want. And again, I'm going to use the blue lines to try and get things, lined up as much as possible. This guy, let's put him right in the corner. These guys will line the baselines up. That's what the double line right there means, that the baseline of the other button line up. And we got also this right line was lined up, so they're going to stick to the edges and stay lined up. So we'll allow outlining and outlining and unoutlining. And then also I'm going to allow setting colors. And the way I'm going to do that is kind of fun. So let's get a button out here. this is a good way to talk about, if I'm resizing, I want this button to be 64 by 64. I know that that's a good size. And I could try and get it exactly the size I want, but it's actually much easier, if you know the size you want, to go over here in the size inspector. You see the size inspector? And you can just type in, I want 64 by 64. Okay? So this size inspector we're going to see when we start talking about auto layout a lot. There's going to be a lot of stuff down here describing how this thing gets constrained when things change size, but it's also good for setting the size. And then once the size is set, I'll move into a nice spot like that. Now, I could put like the word red here and make this a button that has the word red on it, and I could make the text be red. That's what I want this button to do. When I click here, I want whatever selected to turn red. But I'm going to, instead of using words, I'm actually going to use the color. I'm just going to go to the inspector. And since a button inherits from control, and control inherits from view, see how that inheritance hierarchy is working in the inspector, I'm going to go down here and change its background color, which is the same thing we did when we set the background of the whole view to green. And I'm going to set this one to, let's say this one's red. Okay, so now I have a nice red button here, and when I click on this, I'm going to have to wire it up to make this turn red. So let's make some more buttons here of different colors. Again, I'm using the blue lines. See how they're snapping in place? Okay, I'm getting blue lines. Definitely want blue lines as much as possible. So here, let's make this background be green. I'll make this one be orange. Make this one be, oh, I don't know, purple. Okay, so now we have some colors and some outlines, and then let's also make this thing, well, let's put a headline on the top here too. So let me grab another button. Actually, let's do a label for this one because I'm not going to make it clickable. So I'm going to put a label here at top. I'm going to put something like CS193P rocks. Okay, so that's just going to be my title of this thing. Want it nice and centered. Let's move this up so that it's locked. Let's resize it so it maximum space, it locks. And so now I've got this nice user interface. I've used blue guidelines for everything. Everyone's sticking on a blue guideline. That's going to really be advantageous for us when we try to do auto layout with it. Now let's talk a little bit about the fonts I want to use here. And I told you in the slides that when you're displaying user content, okay, you want to use the preferred fonts of the system. Okay? And that's what I'm going to do both for this guy. This is clearly the user content. These two buttons are not user content. They're going to stay the system fonts, okay, because they're buttons. But this title and this body are kind of user content. You could argue that the title is not quite user content, but it kind of is. It might get localized to another language, or it might change depending on what's going on. I don't know, but it's really kind of a headline. So I'm going to use the headline font to display this guy right here. Actually, I also want this centered. All right, so let's make sure that's centered. And so the way you pick the headline font, the preferred font, which is headline, is you inspect the label, and you go here to the fonts, and you can see that it's currently set to be a system font. And I'm going to go down here to text styles and pick headline.